Hello friends, this is Growl. In this video, I'm going to go over the recent updates to Shadowlands both on the beta and PTR. These updates include some balance changes as well as tweaks to conduits and legendaries and some other things. There have been so many changes going on over the last week or two, it's been hard for me to keep up with just structured videos, so I'm going to change the format a bit and just cram a bunch of changes into one. Let's get started. So first I'm going to go over these PTR balance changes. There are two different builds running side by side right now. One is for PTR and one is for the Shadowlands beta. I don't quite understand why they're doing balance changes on both. To me, it doesn't make any sense that they would be balancing for just pre-patch, so I'm going off the assumption that all of the changes in the PTR build are also planned for live. So first we have a flat buff to Feral Druids. When you see this, apply aura modifies damage and healing done. This is showing a flat damage buff to all abilities. It's usually just a blanket change just because they see the damage of Feral is lower. It's slightly lower than 5% in terms of what you're going to see on the meters, and this is definitely a welcome change. Fire mages have received flat damage buffs as well. It's looking like around 10% on a lot of key rotational abilities. Fire Blast, Fireball, Pyroblast, and Flame Strike were all buffed. This is very welcome. Fire mages were basically extinct on beta. I've only ever seen Frost and then a little bit of Arcane. I don't know if I've seen anyone trying Fire since the changes. Holy Paladin had a nerf to Sanctified Wrath. This is the go-to talent on this row. It buffs your wings and reduces Holy Shot cooldown during wings. It doesn't really make sense why they would nerf this until you see a later balance update from the previous patch. So now onto this other build. They've been updating the builds very often. It's not just a weekly thing now. So another flat aura modifier. Balanced druids have been buffed as well. Pretty much all abilities, including the Necrolord ability, Adaptive Swarm, was buffed. And this is another welcome change. Moonkin's damage have been pretty low compared to classes like Frost Mage, Marks Hunter, Destrolock. Shooting Stars was buffed as well. This is cool. One of the big complaints of the Moonkin rotation is that Moonfire and Sunfire don't really do anything. Like, they're good buttons to press because they do damage, but other than that, they don't really fuel your abilities or feel good when you have like 10 targets to multi-dot, even though druids are, or rather balanced druids are technically a multi-dotting spec. Frenzied Regen was buffed as well. This was one of the, I don't want to call it nerfs, but one of the big changes from live to Shadowlands was Frenzied Regen was changed from just a big flat heal to healing. It heals for less, but it also increases healing received, and it felt pretty bad because it didn't really make bears as self-sustainable as they were, but giving Frenzied Regen a buff is a really good change. Again, I would kind of like to see this ability off the global, but the thing about Frenzied Regen is for Guardian Druid, they rely on building Rage very heavily, and because Frenzied Regen costs a global and it costs Rage, not only are you not building Rage, but you're also spending it, so you don't want to be using Frenzied Regen too often, so when you do use it, you kind of want a pretty powerful effect. We see some aura modifiers lowering the damage on Sunfire for Resto Druid. They've been going back and forth on Sunfire for Resto Druid often. I'm really not super worried about it. I don't know. I've seen buffs and nerf constantly. I think they're just offsetting Moonkin changes, or I don't know exactly what's going on. So Holy Shock was buffed. The cooldown from 9 seconds to 7.5. This is a very big change. Holy Shock is essentially all of the healing done from Paladins. During wings, it's all of it, and during not wings, it's still most of it. If you look at a breakdown of healing, a lot of it is Holy Shock, and then Glimmer of Talented, Beacon, which just echoes the healing, and all of that just comes from Holy Shock. Having the cooldown reduced gives them a lot of power outside of wings, so that change of Sanctified Wrath lowering the cooldown of Holy Shock less means that Holy Shock's cooldown during wings is still really short, but the same as before, and now outside of wings, it's significantly shorter. Keep in mind also that Holy Shock's cooldown is reduced by haste, so having haste means you're reducing it even more than 7.5. I am interested to see how this will play out in terms of Holy Paladin's overall HPS. One of their problems is that they struggled with AoE healing. However, I don't know how much Holy Shock's cooldown lowering is going to help that, but it definitely is going to help it some. So it's something that I would have to play around with. Unfortunately, again, these changes are on the PTR, so I can't do Shadowlands beta keys with these changes. I'm not really too sure why they're going on side by side like that. They've slightly changed Schism. They've buffed the initial damage but lowered the damage amp that it gives. I think this is a nerf, but very, very slight. Another cool aura change is a 5% flat damage and healing bonus to Holy Priests. Essentially all abilities, including their Covenant abilities. I see the Necrolord one on here and the Kyrian one. This is definitely a welcome change. I think for healers, it's a little bit more complicated than that. You can't necessarily just apply a flat aura modifier to a healer and then say, okay, now they're good. Because it usually isn't. Like, Holy Priest's throughput and healing is generally fine. It's not their healing that's the problem. They're fine healers. The problem is that they just don't bring as much compared to other healers. I would have liked to seen maybe one. It's hard because it doesn't seem like they want to do any major reworks or, you know, adding abilities at this point, but I'd love to see something that they can give to Holy Priest where it's like, oh, nice, we have a Holy Priest in our group, as opposed to just, you know, man, why isn't this guy playing Disc? So that goes over most of the balance changes. Let's go over some of the other sort of development updates and different changes that have gone on as well. So there's a big blue post a little under a week ago talking about some of the issues in the game. A lot of people have complained about the development of Shadowlands, but in my opinion, they've been very transparent and they've been talking about a lot of changes. I'm still very hopeful that this game could be good. It's a bit unfortunate that Mythic Plus seems a little lackluster given that there's only 8 dungeons on release. The loot isn't great and some of the dungeons don't seem as fun. However, in terms of everything else of the game, all the systems, the legendaries, the acquisition of the legendaries, the conduits, it seems like they're at least talking with the community. They may not listen and do whatever the community says, which in my opinion is a good thing. Sometimes the community doesn't always know what they want. I just wanted to compliment them and say, as much as people want to be frustrated about covenants, I'm actually looking forward to a lot of what's going on here. So first, they're talking about the Maw. The Maw was sort of the end game zone. Yeah, it's terrible. I don't know what else to say, but this is a very unfun area. I don't know. I'm just not much of an open world player, so there's not very many open worlds that I'm going to have fun in, but this one is just bad. There's just nothing going on, so they're essentially saying, look, we know it's bad, so we're going to try and make it better. That's great. They're talking about the conduit system. The conduit system is turning into the most important part of the expansion. Now, with Covenant abilities getting nerfed really hard to the point where they're somewhat balanced, and legendaries are also an important system in the game, but right now conduits are shaping up to be the biggest sort of impactful borrowed power system in Shadowlands, so I'm really interested to see how this works out. They talked about Conduit Energy, which is frustrating. Blizzard has been doing this thing where they don't want people to change stuff, but then people get mad, and then they kind of like give them half of what they want, and then they introduce these like really convoluted systems so that they can kind of change it sometimes. In my opinion, conduits are passives and they should be changed in the loadout, and you should be able to change them whenever you want. It doesn't really make sense. They've also said that Covenant balance, they're working on it. In my opinion, the Covenants are actually starting to become somewhat balanced. The problem is just they're all getting nerfed, so, you know, eventually none of them are going to feel that good, which is, I mean, I guess what people wanted, right? They don't want player power tied to Covenants, so the weaker the Covenants, the happier people are. I personally kind of liked some of the really powerful Covenant abilities, but I guess that's fine. Doesn't really matter too much to me. So here's the blue post explaining how the new conduit switching system is going to work. Essentially, there's going to be a resource called Conduit Energy. When you change your conduits or place conduits in a slot, it will consume energy. Your energy will recharge 1 per day, and you'll also get energy when you add a new conduit to your collection. So let's say you're out of energy, but you find a new conduit, you can still put that in. It's good that they changed this so that you can switch conduits more often. However, I still think it's very unnecessary friction in the system. And at this point, it's not a meaningful choice at all. It's just a very convoluted system that stops you from doing what you want sometimes. So I think they should just allow you to change them freely at this point. They've also announced in a blue post that they are in the process, quote unquote, of tuning legendary items. I'm not sure why they're nerfing these so hard. Like, every class now is starting to feel like all of the legendaries are bad. It almost seems like they realized it was I don't know what's going on here. So essentially, at least from my point of view, I play Discipline Priest. I love Discipline Priest on beta. Really, the only viable fun legendary was Kiss of Death that buffed your Shadow Word Death. And that legendary was essentially removed from the game. It's just like really bad now. Holy Paladins had almost no good legendaries. Druids had the Life Bloom buffing one and the Swiftmen buffing legendary, and both of those were nerfed. Mistweavers used Tear of the Morning, and that one was nerfed. It just didn't make any sense why they're nerfing all the legendaries. It's like, the fact that you can deterministically craft the legendary that you want, and you can swap out the legendary in between encounters, means that legendary should be really, really powerful. And it should, you should feel like, wow, I'm really happy I'm using this legendary. And now people ask me about, oh, which legendaries look good for Druid? And I'm just like, man, none of them really feel that good. And maybe I'm biased because I've played all of the pre-nerf versions, but I'm glad to see that they at least acknowledge this is a problem. I'm a little skeptical that they just go backwards. Almost never do, especially Blizzard, but gaming companies in general or developers go back on what they do, and when they nerf something they restore it and say they're wrong. So I would really like to see all of these changes get reverted and instead have some of the weaker legendaries buffed. I mean, that's essentially been a theme of what Shadowlands balance has been like. It's been nerf everything that's an outlier instead of buff the bottom end, which is okay. Like, in terms of the finished product, you don't notice it too much, but the problem is a lot of the classes and systems and legendaries and covenant abilities just don't feel as fun as they could be because, well, they got nerfed. So they've also made a big change to conduits. If you're not familiar with how these work, there are 3 different types of conduits. You have potency, finesse, and endurance. You have 4 different conduit slots you can choose. The best type by far is potency. And so what ends up happening is you end up choosing the tree, which gives you as many potency slots as possible, which was 3. Then you would have 3 potency and then only 1 of the other ones, which was a little bit frustrating because there were a lot of fun looking or interesting finesse or endurance conduits. However, the potency ones were just ones that boosted your damage or healing. So they were the ones that were go-tos. And I actually really like this change that they did, only having 2 potency conduits max per tree. This means that you get a little ability to try out some of the other finesse ones and endurance conduits, which actually I think are kind of fun and even more fun in a lot of situations than the potencies. A lot of the potencies are just like adds damage or adds healing to an ability, whereas finesse ones or endurance ones were more like interesting, like they would change the way abilities work, or they would maybe add some synergy between abilities that weren't there before. So I'm glad to see this change. I think it's good. Some people are frustrated. It definitely shakes things up a little bit because there are some classes that have lots of really good potency conduits, and there are others that don't. So essentially, this is a nerf to any class which had a lot of good potency conduits because they can only use 2 now instead of 3. This post is pretty recent. In a tweet, Ian posted that trinkets are largely still overtuned. This is in response to a video that Stoops put out, essentially saying, WTF is Blizzard doing? These trinkets are ridiculous. You can't have multiple cheat deaths and giant health absorb shields on people in PvP. Again, while it's an issue that they put these things in the game, it's good that they've been open about it and talking about these things, and they recognize that it's a problem. Personally, I think they I don't know, there's just such a huge disconnect between PvP and PvE for the top end players that it's really hard to reach a middle ground here. Like, you essentially just have to have things disabled, and PvP is really the only way, because some of these trinkets and abilities aren't even that bad for PvE, so they either have to nerf them out of existence, or like, I don't know, I feel like they put in too much work trying to make things mesh between PvE and PvP, but the more they just turn stuff off for PvP, I think the easier it will be for them. Another update that came out recently was they changed the diminishing returns for Shadowlands. If you're not familiar with this system, in very brief, it makes it so if you're very heavily stacking one stat, it is a little bit worse for you, is how it works. And it was sort of to combat the situation where, let's say haste is a really, really good stat for you, and then you get this insane weapon from the mythic raid, but it doesn't have haste on it, and you're like, wow, this actually is not very good for me. Well, it's slightly better for you. It's not really a big deal. It's barely noticeable, and they made it even less noticeable. So before, the scaling turned on at 25%, and now it turns on at 30%. It's really hard to get 30% of a stat in Shadowlands. This is something that you probably won't even worry about for the first entire raid tier, and maybe even the second one. I think any class that needs any class that has one stat that's that good that you're stacking it, a 10% penalty probably isn't going to do much for you. Overall, I wouldn't worry about this system too much. It's just going to be something that's going on in the background that may make some sim results or other things seem weird, but otherwise won't change your gameplay hardly at all. And the last change, they have changed the way water works slightly. They've made it more similar to PvP, where if you press water in a dungeon, or I guess a raid or whatever, your mana regen per second is slow initially, and then it builds up over time. This, in short, means that as a healer, you're going to need to be drinking more in dungeons, which is kind of annoying. I don't really like this change. It's not very impactful. So they have a chart here on Wowhead. So if you only need to get a quick drink of mana for a few seconds, it's actually like you lose a few extra seconds on PTR. But if it's like a really long drink, like anything over 8, it's essentially unchanged, because that's when the higher mana regen kicks in. This change doesn't affect things too much. It's kind of annoying the way it works, though. It's like a PvP change that just kind of leaked into dungeons. One thing to note is that the fish fees from the Darkmoon Fair are unchanged. They still work twice as fast as regular food, and now even faster at the beginning. So these will be very, very important if this change stays in. I would imagine they would, I don't know, you would have thought they would have nerfed these fish feasts a long time ago, but I guess they want to keep the Darkmoon Fair or whatever relevant. That goes over all of the important changes to the Shadowlands beta and PTR over the last week. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, I'd appreciate it if you gave it a like and subscribe to my channel. I'll be coming out with tons more Shadowlands videos, from guides and walkthroughs to informational news stuff like this. I also stream on Twitch, so don't forget to check me out there. Happy keying.